Hey guys, so in the last lesson we talked about the digestive system. Today we're going to be talking about another system that helps with waste excretion, the excretory system. So the excretory system does focus on all of the different ways that our body excretes waste. We are going to be focusing specifically on the part of the excretory system that has to do with urine formation and excretion, so the urinary system part of the excretory system. So you do need to know the different structures of that system and their functions. You need to know the different parts of the kidney as well as the different parts of the nephron. And you have to know how urine is formed, including how substances move into and out of the nephron during that process of urine formation. So the whole purpose of the excretory system is to just eliminate harmful substances from the body. That includes ammonia, which is a highly toxic substance produced in the liver anytime excess proteins are broken down. Also urea, which is what ammonia is converted into in the liver, and uric acid, which is produced when nucleic acid, like DNA, for example, is broken down. The excretory system is also responsible for maintaining the water balance in your body. So the balance of how much water and how much dissolved stuff is in the water in your body. So that's like your water and ion concentrations. And to help maintain the blood pH of your body. So the structures of the excretory system that we're going to be focusing on are the two kidneys. Those are responsible for filtering waste products out of the blood and producing urine. Your two kidneys are located in your lower back on either side of your spine. Then we have the renal artery. Renal just means kidney. So the renal artery carries blood from the aorta to the kidney. And then the renal vein carries blood away from the kidney to the inferior vena cava of the heart. Anytime you have something that's an artery, it's going away from the heart. So in this case, away from the heart towards the kidney. Anytime you have a vein, it's going back towards the heart. So the renal vein is away from the kidney towards the heart. Then we have the ureter, which carries urine away from each kidney towards the bladder. The bladder then stores the urine and stretches out as it fills. Once it stretches enough, there are receptors inside the bladder that can actually send a signal to the nervous system that then tells your brain that you have to urinate. The urinary sphincter is a circular muscle at the bottom of the bladder that controls the release of urine or closes in order to stop you from just peeing your pants. And then the urethra is the tube that carries urine from the kidney to the outside of the body. So this is what it would look like. These kind of little bean-shaped structures are the two kidneys. The little like hats on top of the kidneys are your adrenal glands. We'll get to those later. But yeah, these are the two kidneys. Then you have the renal artery, which is bringing blood from the heart, which is above to both of the kidneys. And then the renal vein is bringing blood from the kidneys back up towards the heart. And then urine is formed inside the kidneys and then is carried through the ureters, which are these tubes right here, to the bladder, which is at the bottom here. At the very base of the bladder would be the urinary sphincter. And then when the urinary sphincter opens, it releases urine out of the bladder, down through the urethra, and then out of the body. So the kidney does have multiple layers. The outside of the kidney is called the renal cortex, and it's made of connective tissue. The inside of the kidney is called the renal medulla, and then the renal pelvis is a hollow area inside the kidney where the ureter kind of branches out into different sections of the kidney. Within the cortex and the medulla of each kidney, there is about 1 million nephrons, and the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. So inside the nephrons is where blood filtration and urine production both happen. So all of the function of the kidney takes place in the nephrons. So yeah, this is a kidney here. This kind of hollow part in this area is the renal pelvis. The white is the ureter that comes in and then branches out once it gets into the renal pelvis. These kind of like darker spots are the renal medulla, and then the pale outside layer is the renal cortex. And if we kind of zoom in on that section, it would be like this area right here that is including both the renal medulla and the renal cortex. If we zoom in on that, you can see these nephrons. So there's like millions and millions of nephrons. This is just one example of nephron, and if we zoom in, this is what the nephron looks like. So the nephron, essentially, again, like I said, is the functional unit of the kidney. You have small branches from the renal artery called the afferent arterioles that essentially carry blood into the nephrons. The afferent arterioles branch further into capillaries, which are just smaller blood vessels, and then it forms a capillary bed, which is an area that's really densely packed with these capillaries. That capillary bed is called the glomerulus. Blood is going to leave the glomerulus via the efferent capillaries, which then spread out into a web of pertubular capillaries that wrap around the loop of Henle, and then blood goes back to the renal vein. The Bowman's capsule is a structure that cups around the outside of the glomerulus, that capillary bed. So let's just flip back here for a second. So this big red blob here, that is the capillary bed, that is the glomerulus. If you can see here, there's like a pale yellow kind of like circle around the outside of the glomerulus, that is Bowman's capsule. And then the blood vessels that come to the glomerulus are the afferent arterioles. The ones that leave the capillary bed are the efferent arterioles. And then this whole like web, all of this blue here, the blue is a web of pertubular capillaries. So when blood enters the glomerulus, that dense capillary bed, fluid is going to move from the blood into the Bowman's capsule, essentially. So the fluid that is in that capillary bed, in the blood in the capillary bed, some of that fluid diffuses out into Bowman's capsule. From there, the fluid moves into the proximal tubule, then the loop of Henle, which is this big loop that goes really deep into the medulla of the kidney, and then back up again. Then the fluid moves into the distal tubule and then collecting. So it goes glomerulus, Bowman's capsule, proximal tubule, loop of Henle, distal tubule, collecting duct. And then the collecting duct is going to bring the urine to the renal pelvis, where it goes into those branches and then into the ureter down to the bladder. So this again is our glomerulus. This is the capillary bed. The blood comes into the capillary bed via the afferent arteriole, then goes through the capillaries and then back out via the efferent arteriole. But when the blood is going through this capillary bed, not the blood itself, but fluid in the blood is going to diffuse from the capillary bed into the Bowman's capsule that is surrounding it. And then from there, so this is the Bowman's capsule right here, from there, the fluid is going to go through the proximal tubule, loop of Henle, which is this big deep loop right here, the loop of Henle, then the distal tubule, and then lastly the collecting duct. We're going to talk about what's happening in each of those areas. And then once again, you can see on here this like blue and red kind of web of capillaries. Those are the pertubule capillaries. Okay, so how is urine formed? So first, blood is going to move into the nephron through those afferent arterioles and then into the glomerulus. In the glomerulus, Some of the water and some of the stuff dissolved in the water is going to move from the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. Again, not the blood itself, just some of the fluid and the stuff dissolved in the fluid. So that includes things like salt, hydrogen ions, amino acids, sugar, urea, all of that kind of stuff. And then from the Bowman's capsule, it's going to go into the proximal tubule. In the proximal tubule, you have positive ions that are pumped out of the tubule into just the intercellular space. So that includes things like sodium, potassium, and hydrogen, again, actively pumped out of the proximal tubule. And then negative ions, like bicarbonate ions and chlorine ions, are going to follow the positive ions out of the proximal tubule, not because they're actively pumped, but just because they're attracted to the positive ions that are leaving. So they're just going to follow. And then water is also going to leave the proximal tubule because of osmosis. Water always follows wherever the dissolved ions are. So if the dissolved ions are leaving the proximal tubule, osmosis says that water must also leave the proximal tubule. Then we go into the descending loop of Henle, which is the down part of the loop of Henle. At that point, water is going to continue to leave because of osmosis, but in that area of the nephron, ions can't move in and out. So the ions are trapped in that section. Then we go back up the ascending side of loop of Henle. At this area, salt is now able to diffuse out, so like chlorine and sodium and stuff like that. And all of this is reabsorption. So reabsorption just refers to the movement of solutes, so dissolved stuff, or water moving out of the kidney back into the blood. So you're reabsorbing it into your blood from the kidney. So that's what's happening. Anytime we have something moving out of the nephron, it's reabsorption. And reabsorption can happen until you have like a threshold that's reached, and then essentially no more ions can leave the urine. And this is regulated by a hormone called aldosterone, which we're going to talk about in a later lesson. Okay, then we get to the distal tubule of the nephron. Here we have more active transport happening. So substances like ammonia, some hydrogen ions, some mineral ions, they're actively pumped into the distal tubule. And then from there, any of the remaining fluid is going to move to the collecting duct. There is some water that can continue to leave the collecting duct, so the urine becomes more concentrated. There's less water and more ions. And then all of that urine gets carried from the collecting duct to the renal pelvis, where it'll like a whole bunch of collecting ducts will like branch together to form the ureter. Okay, so these are just two different diagrams of what this would look like. So this is our glomerulus. So blood comes in through the afferent arterioles, blood goes out through the efferent arterioles, all of these capillaries down here, in this case purple and blue are the tubular capillaries. So what will happen is the fluid in the glomerulus capsule and the dissolved stuff in the fluid goes into, all of the fluid and dissolved stuff in the glomerulus goes into the Bowman's capsule. Then it travels into the proximal tubule, which is right here. In that proximal tubule, our positive ions are pumped out, the negative ions and the water will follow. Then we go from there into the descending loop of Henle, which is right here. Water is going to continue to come out of that area. As we go up the ascending side, our salt ions are going to start coming out again, just through diffusion. Then we get into the distal tubule, which is this wiggly part up here. That's where we have ions pumped into the distal tubule, things like hydrogen ions and ammonia and stuff like that. And then we get into the collecting duct, which, where my mouse go, is right here. At that point, we can still have water leaving, but that is it. And then the collecting duct essentially forms up with other collecting ducts to form the ureter. And you can see some of that happening over here. So again, we have our ions being pumped out, water leaving because of osmosis, sodium diffusing out, more ions pumped in, water leaving. And I'll go through all this again at the end. Again, just another kind of description of what's happening here. So this is our glomerulus. Solutes and water move from the glomerulus to the Bowman's capsule. As we go into the proximal tubule, your positive ions are pumped out, negative ions follow because of attraction, water follows because of osmosis. Then we go into the descending loop of Henle where water keeps coming out because of osmosis, but salts cannot. Then as we go up the ascending loop of Henle right here, salt is going to diffuse out. Then we get into the distal tubule where things like ammonia and hydrogen are pumped back in. And then we get into the collecting duct where water continues to leave and urine becomes more concentrated. Okay, so that is kind of one of probably the biggest job of the kidney is that urine formation. But as we mentioned, it does also help with regulating your blood pH. The human body needs a pH of roughly 7.4. Obviously, different food and drinks have different pHs, and you don't want those pHs of things that you eat to affect your blood pH. Also, during cellular respiration, anytime carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product, some of that is actually converted into carbonic acid, which can lower your blood pH by producing hydrogen ions and stuff like that. Bicarbonate ions are basic and can neutralize the acidity. And we'll talk about all that when we get to the respiratory system. But that is, something that's constantly happening. We're constantly breathing, and we're breathing out carbon dioxide. But in that process of getting carbon dioxide from our cells, where cellular respiration is producing the carbon dioxide to our lungs when we can breathe them out, that process involves some of the carbon dioxide dissolving in our blood and turning into carbonic acid. And we need to make sure that that carbonic acid doesn't lower our blood pH too much. So the kidney kind of helps to balance the amount of hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions in our blood to maintain an ideal pH. Okay, I'm gonna quickly flip over to my document cam just to once again review what's happening in the nephron because there's a lot going on there. Okay, so first we'll just review the different parts of the nephron. So we have the afferent arteriole that comes into the glomerulus, which is right here, and then the efferent arteriole, and then all of these like dark areas and all of these like webbing, that is all the proximal tubules, or sorry, not the proximal tubules, the protubular capillaries. So this is all the protubural capillaries. The glomerulus, like I said, is here. That's the capillary bed. Around that, we have the Bowman's capsule. This tube right here, this wiggly one, is the proximal tubule. It goes down into the descending loop of Henle and then the ascending loop of Henle. And then this wiggly bit up here is the distal tubule. And then that goes into the collecting duct. Now let's talk about what's happening in all of those different areas. So anywhere where I have red, that is active transport where molecules are being pumped. Anything that's purple or dark is passive transport, so diffusion or osmosis if we're talking about water. So again, the molecules are going to move from the blood in that capillary bed into the Bowman's capsule. And then as the fluid goes through the proximal tubule right here, your positive ions like hydrogen, sodium, and potassium, those are actively pumped out. And then negative ions like chlorine will just follow because of diffusion, and water will follow because of osmosis. Then as we get into the descending loop of Henle, we continue to have water leave just because of osmosis. As we go up the ascending side of the loop of Henle, we have our salt ions start to just diffuse out. Then we get into the distal tubule, which is distant from the start of this. The distal tubule now has ions being pumped into the nephron, so things like ammonia and hydrogen. And then as we get into the collecting duct here, we continue to have water leave. Okay, and the collecting duct would just lead again to all the other branches of collecting ducts in the renal pelvis, where they would come together to form the ureter, which carries the urine to the bladder. Okay, so that is the nephron. And then just to kind of review the entire thing here, these little beans on either side are the kidneys. The outside layer is the renal cortex. These kind of middle layers in here are the renal medulla. This empty space in here is the renal pelvis. All of these little branches would be like the collecting ducts that are coming together to the ureters, which there's one on either side here. These are the two ureters. They carry the urine down to the bladder at the bottom here. There would be a little urinary sphincter right about there, and then the urethra at the bottom. And in females, the urethra is fairly short. In males, it's longer because it goes through the penis. And then in the very middle here, we have our two blood vessels. Whichever blood vessel is coming down, and I've just drawn arrows here to show which one I think is coming down. The one that's coming down is the renal artery because it's going away from the heart. And the one that's going upwards towards the heart is the renal vein. Okay, that's it for today's lesson. Let me know if you have any questions.